June 27th, 1944. 13,000 feet above Jeffman Island, New Guinea. Captain Charles MacDonald banks his P-38 Lightning hard right, watching a civilian in his 40s, a man who hasn't touched military controls in over 20 years, slide into perfect formation off his wing. The civilian's aircraft, borrowed from America's top ace Dick Bong, carries no markings identifying its pilot, no rank insignia, no squadron colours, just the serial number and the faded paint of a Lightning that's already seen too much combat. MacDonald keys his radio. "Mr. Lindbergh, you're clear to follow us in. Stay high. Watch for ACAC." Charles Lindbergh doesn't respond immediately. He's too busy calculating. Fuel flow, manifold pressure, engine temperature. The numbers running through his head contradict everything the Army Air Forces teaches its pilots about the Allison V-1710 engines powering his twin-boom fighter. According to official doctrine, what Lindbergh's about to do should destroy both engines before he makes it home. According to his mathematics, it should give him an extra 400 miles of range. The difference between those two numbers will determine whether American fighters can reach deep into Japanese-held territory, or whether bomber crews continue dying alone over targets their escorts can't reach. Below, the green jungle of New Guinea stretches to the horizon. Somewhere in that expanse, hundreds of Japanese positions wait. Anti-aircraft batteries, hidden airfields, supply depots that feed the Empire's war machine. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. MacDonald's voice crackles again. "All aircraft, combat spread. We're going in." The formation drops, 4 P-38 Lightnings screaming toward Kaibo's Bay at over 350 miles per hour. Lindbergh keeps his position, though his mind is elsewhere on fuel burn rates, on cruise configurations, on the revolutionary technique he's been testing that every engine expert says will grenade the power plants. They strafe a Japanese barge. Lindbergh fires his guns, technically prohibited for a civilian observer, but nobody's watching out here. The barge erupts in flames. The Lightnings climb back to altitude, MacDonald already calculating the return flight. That's when the ground crew chief notices something impossible. Back at base, 4 hours later, Master Sergeant Mike Rodriguez watches the Lightnings taxi in. He's got fuel records for every aircraft in the squadron. He knows exactly how much gas each pilot burns on a standard mission to Jeffman. MacDonald's Lightning, 300 gallons remaining. Lieutenant Maguire's Lightning, 280 gallons. Lieutenant Smith's Lightning, 310 gallons. The civilian's Lightning, 490 gallons. Rodriguez stares at his clipboard. He counts again. Same number. He walks over to Lindbergh's aircraft as the propellers wind down. "Sir, I need to check your fuel gauges. I think we got a malfunction." Lindbergh climbs down from the cockpit, his flight suit soaked with sweat. At 42 years old, he's just survived his first combat mission since 1918. He pulls off his leather gloves and looks at the crew chief. "The gauges are fine, Sergeant. I just flew the aircraft differently than your pilots do." Rodriguez frowns. "Differently how?" "I ran the engines at 1600 RPM instead of 2200. Increased manifold pressure to 30 inches. Auto lean mixture instead of auto rich." The crew chief's face goes pale. "Sir, you can't do that. That'll blow the engines. It's in every manual, every training document. You violate those limits, you destroy the power plants." Lindbergh smiles. "I've been doing it for 20 years, Sergeant. The manuals are wrong." That night, MacDonald calls a meeting. Word has spread through the squadron. The civilian, the famous Charles Lindbergh, Lucky Lindy, the lone eagle who flew solo to Paris, came back from a combat mission with nearly twice the fuel reserve of any other pilot. The operations tent fills with men, pilots who've been flying P-38 seconds for 2 years, mechanics who've been maintaining them since Guadalcanal. Everyone wants to know how the old man pulled it off. MacDonald introduces Lindbergh, but the room stays skeptical. These are combat veterans. They've lost friends to engine failures, mechanical breakdowns, fuel exhaustion. The idea that some barnstorming hero from 1927 can teach them anything about their own aircraft seems absurd. Lindbergh stands before them, still in his sweat-stained flight suit. No notes, no charts, just numbers he's been calculating since his solo Atlantic crossing 17 years earlier. Gentlemen, your standard operating procedure has you cruising at 2200 RPM, manifold pressure around 24 inches, mixture set to auto-rich. Is that correct? Heads nod around the tent. That configuration burns approximately 190 gallons per hour across both engines. On a standard 7-hour mission to, say, Balikpapan, you're burning 1,330 gallons. Your internal capacity is 410 gallons. With two 165-gallon drop tanks, you have 740 gallons total. That gives you roughly 6 hours of flight time before you're running on fumes. Am I calculating correctly? More nods. The math checks out. Everyone in the tent has sweated through missions where fuel gauges drop toward empty with enemy territory still below. Now, Lindbergh continues, if you reduce RPM to 1600, increase manifold pressure to 30 inches, and switch to auto-lean mixture, fuel consumption drops to approximately 120 gallons per hour. Same 7-hour mission now burns only 840 gallons. You land with a full hour of reserve fuel. A pilot in the back raises his hand. Lieutenant Frank Nichols, a veteran of 30 missions. Sir, with respect, we've been explicitly told never to run low RPM with high manifold pressure. The manuals say it causes detonation, blown pistons, catastrophic engine failure. The manuals, Lindbergh says quietly, were written by engineers who never flew long-distance missions. They were designed for maximum performance in combat situations lasting 10 to 15 minutes, not cruise efficiency for 7-hour patrols. But the Allison V1710 has a turbo supercharger that most of your manual writers don't fully understand, Lindbergh interrupts. Below 30 inches of manifold pressure, the turbo isn't fully engaged. The wastegate is still partially open. You're operating in a regime where the engine behaves more like a normally aspirated power plant than a boosted one. At 1600 RPM, the piston speed is low enough that you're not generating excessive cylinder pressures. The auto-lean mixture prevents over-rich combustion that would cause detonation. He pauses, letting the technical details sink in. I've been flying this exact configuration since 1927. Different aircraft, same principles. When I flew the Spirit of Street, Louis to Paris, I used low RPM and high throttle to maximize range. 9 gallons per hour fuel burn on a right whirlwind that was rated for 14. That's how I crossed the Atlantic on 450 gallons. MacDonald speaks up. Mr. Lindbergh, you're saying we can extend our combat radius from 570 miles to over 700 miles just by changing our cruise settings. 700 to 750, yes. And you'll still have a 1-hour fuel reserve when you return. The tent erupts in conversation, pilots arguing with mechanics citing technical manuals, everyone trying to process the implications. Lieutenant Maguire, already an ace with 21 kills, stands. Sir, if what you're saying is true, we could escort bombers all the way to Balikpapan. We could hit targets we haven't been able to reach. You could change the entire strategic situation in the Southwest Pacific, Lindbergh finishes. Yes. The Allison Engine Company has never certified the 1710 for continuous operation at low RPM and high manifold pressure. Army Air Force's regulations forbid pilots from exceeding published limitations. And if Lindbergh's wrong, if his calculations contain even a small error, dozens of engines will fail mid-flight over Japanese-held territory. Dozens of pilots will die. MacDonald looks around the tent. These men trust him with their lives. Now he's asking them to trust a 42-year-old civilian who's flown exactly one combat mission in a P-38. Gentlemen, I'm not ordering anyone to try Mr. Lindbergh's technique. It's voluntary. Anyone who wants to test it can do so on the next mission. We'll monitor results and make a decision based on data. 12 hands go up. 12 pilots willing to risk their engines and their lives on mathematics that contradict every training manual they've ever read. The next morning, 13 P-38 Lightnings take off from Biak Airfield. MacDonald leads. Lindbergh flies, wingman. Behind them, 12 volunteers, all running their engines at settings that should, according to official doctrine, destroy their aircraft before they reach the target. The mission objective: a Japanese supply depot at Manokwari, 480 miles north. Round trip, 960 miles. With standard cruise settings, the Lightnings would be borderline on fuel. With Lindbergh's settings, they should have reserves. Should. MacDonald watches his fuel gauges as they cross the coastline. He's running 1600 RPM. 30 inches manifold pressure, auto-lean mixture. The engines sound different, quieter, smoother, almost too quiet. His hand hovers near the throttles, ready to increase RPM if he hears the first hint of detonation. Nothing. The formation drones north. 1 hour, 2 hours. Fuel consumption tracking exactly where Lindbergh predicted. At the 3-hour mark, MacDonald does math in his head. At standard settings, he'd be burning reserves by now. Instead, his tanks still show over half full. They hit the target at 14,000 feet. Japanese anti-aircraft fire fills the sky. The Lightnings drop their bombs, strafe ground positions, climb back to altitude. The entire engagement lasts 8 minutes. On the return flight, MacDonald can't stop staring at his fuel gauges. 4 hours into the mission. 5 hours. 6 hours. The math keeps working. Lindbergh's calculations proving accurate to within 5 gallons. They land at Biak after 7 hours and 15 minutes of flight time. MacDonald's Lightning has 180 gallons remaining. Under standard cruise settings, he would have landed with less than 40 gallons, barely enough for a single go-around if the approach went wrong. Lindbergh's Lightning has 230 gallons left, enough fuel to fly another 90 minutes if needed. The ground crews swarm the aircraft, checking engines, looking for signs of detonation damage, scored cylinders, blown piston rings. They find nothing. The engines are pristine, no excessive wear, no carbon build-up, no indication of stress beyond normal operations. Rodriguez, the crew chief who first noticed Lindbergh's fuel consumption, pulls MacDonald aside. "Colonel, I've been working on these engines for 2 years. According to everything I know, what you just did should have destroyed them. But they're fine. Better than fine, there's less carbon fouling than I usually see after a standard mission." MacDonald nods slowly. "Sergeant, I think we've been flying these aircraft wrong since they entered service." That night, word reaches 5th Air Force Headquarters in Brisbane. General George Kenny, commanding officer of Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, summons Lindbergh for a meeting. The meeting doesn't go well. Kenny's staff includes engineering officers from Wright Field, technical representatives from Lockheed and Allison, combat commanders who've been flying P-38 seconds since Guadalcanal. They all have the same objection. Lindbergh's technique violates established procedures. Major Harold Peterson, an Allison technical representative, stands. "General, Mr. Lindbergh is recommending operational parameters that our engineers have never certified. The V-1710 was not designed for continuous low RPM, high manifold pressure operation. We cannot guarantee reliability under those conditions." "Your engines are already unreliable," Lindbergh responds. "Your pilots are losing power plants to carbon fouling, stuck piston rings, and thermal shock because they're running too rich and too fast in cruise configuration. The high RPM generates unnecessary mechanical stress. The rich mixture causes carbon buildup. You're creating the very problems you're trying to avoid." "That's speculation," Peterson counters. "We have decades of reciprocating engine design experience that says I have 20 years of practical flight experience that says you're wrong." Lindbergh's voice is quiet but firm. "I've flown this exact configuration on radial engines, inline engines, air-cooled, and liquid-cooled power plants. The physics don't change. Low RPM with moderate boost is more efficient than high RPM with low boost." General Kenny interrupts. "Gentlemen, I don't care about your theoretical debates. I care about combat radius. Mr. Lindbergh, You're saying your technique can extend P-38 range by 200 miles? At minimum, possibly up to 400 miles with optimal technique. Kenny's eyes narrow. That would let us escort bombers to Balikpapan, to Brunei, to targets we haven't been able to hit because our fighters can't make the distance. Yes, sir. And you've tested this technique how many times? Hundreds of flights over 20 years. In the P-38 specifically? Twice. The room goes silent. Lindbergh is asking the entire 5th Air Force to adopt a technique he's used exactly twice in the aircraft type in question. Kenny leans back in his chair. He's a practical man, a bomber pilot who understands the brutal mathematics of Pacific warfare. Every bomber mission without fighter escort costs him crews. Good men dying because their escorts have to turn back at the German border. No, wrong theatre. At the limit of fuel range. Major Peterson, what's your assessment of actual risk? The Allison representative hesitates. Sir, in laboratory conditions, Mr. Lindbergh's parameters should be safe, but combat operations involve variables we can't predict. Temperature fluctuations, fuel quality variations, combat-induced stress. Any one of those factors could push the engines beyond safe limits. Could, Kenny repeats. Not will. Could. Yes, sir. Kenny looks at MacDonald. Colonel, you've flown this technique. Your assessment? My engines performed flawlessly, sir. Better than standard operations. And I landed with reserves I've never had before. If we can replicate this across the fighter groups, it changes everything we can do in this theatre. Kenny nods slowly. Then he makes a decision that will alter the Pacific Air War. Mr. Lindbergh, you're going to train every P-38 pilot in 5th Air Force on your technique, starting tomorrow. You'll fly with each squadron, demonstrate your methods, monitor results. If we see systematic engine failures, we stop immediately. But if your math works, and Colonel MacDonald says it does, we're adopting this as standard procedure. He turns to Peterson. Major, you're going to document every flight, engine performance, fuel, consumption, maintenance requirements. We're going to prove or disprove Mr. Lindbergh's theory with data, not speculation. Peterson starts to object, then sees Kenny's face. Yes, sir. Lindbergh spends the next 6 weeks flying with P-38 squadrons across New Guinea. The 433rd Fighter Squadron, the 432nd, the 431st. Each time, the same pattern repeats. Skeptical pilots, worried mechanics, fuel gauges that refuse to drop as fast as they should. By August 1944, every P-38 unit in 5th Air Force has adopted Lindbergh's cruise technique. The results are documented in mission reports that read like fiction. Mission to Balikpapan, August 10th. 850 miles round trip. All aircraft returned with minimum 1-hour fuel reserve. 0 engine failures. Mission to Brunei, August 15th. 920 miles. All aircraft returned. 1 hour 20 minutes fuel reserve. 0 engine failures. Mission to Celebes, August 23rd. 1,040 miles. Bomber escort complete. Fuel reserves exceeded predictions. 0 engine failures. The Japanese notice. Luftwaffe no. Wrong enemy again. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force and Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service start encountering American fighters hundreds of miles beyond where they expected them. Targets that were safe are suddenly vulnerable. Bomber formations that used to fly alone now have escort all the way to the target. Captain Saburo Shimada, a Japanese observation pilot with 19 victories, writes in his diary on July 28th. Encountered American twin-engine fighters over Seram. Expected them to turn back at maximum range. They did not. They pursued us to our own airfield. Our tactical assumptions are obsolete. Shimada dies later that day, shot down by Charles Lindbergh flying a P-38 Lightning, using fuel management techniques that shouldn't exist according to every engineering manual in the American inventory. But the real revolution isn't just range, it's climb, performance. Part 2. How one engineer's banned fuel injection, Let P-38 seconds. Climb 4,000 feet per minute over zeros. September 3rd, 1944, 22,000 feet above Halmahera Island. Lieutenant Thomas Maguire spots them, first 6 Mitsubishi. A 6 M0s climbing toward a formation of B-24 Liberators at 25,000 feet. Maguire's already an ace. 21 confirmed kills. He knows the Zero's strengths. At low altitude, it can outturn anything America flies. Its climb rate below 15,000 feet is legendary over 3,000 feet per minute. Japanese pilots use that advantage ruthlessly, climbing above American fighters, then diving through formations in slashing attacks. But today, Maguire's P-38 is different. Not in armament, not in armor, in something far more fundamental: how he's been taught to use his engines. He keys his radio. Hades flight, bandits climbing through 18,000. 6 zeros. Engage. Standard doctrine says run the engines up to maximum power, 2,600 RPM, 54 inches of manifold pressure, war emergency power. Push the Allisons to their absolute limits. Maguire does something else entirely, something he learned from a 42-year-old civilian who isn't supposed to be in a combat zone at all. He leaves the RPM at 1,600, advances the throttles to 60 inches of manifold pressure, switches mixture to auto-rich. The P-38 leaps upward like it's been kicked. Below him, his wingman, Lieutenant Joel Paris, follows the same procedure. Behind Paris, 2 more Lightnings climbing in formation, all using techniques that violate every power-setting chart in the pilot's handbook. The Zeros are at 19,000 feet when they spot the Americans. The Japanese pilots immediately push their Sake engines to maximum 2,700 RPM, full throttle. Standard Zero doctrine. Climb above the enemy, use altitude advantage to dictate engagement. At 20,000 feet, the Zero formation is climbing at 2,800 feet per minute. Excellent performance for 1944. Good enough to beat any American fighter below 20,000 feet. Maguire's Lightning is climbing at 3,800 feet per minute. The Zero leader, Lieutenant Takeo Tanemizu, watches in disbelief as 4 P-38 seconds aircraft he knows are slower climbers than his Zeros simply walk away from him in vertical performance. At 22,000 feet, the Lightnings are 1,000 feet above his formation and still climbing. Tanemizu has 217 hours in the Zero. He knows every performance chart. The American P-38 Lightning climbs at approximately 2,700 feet per minute at sea level, degrading to 2,200 feet per minute at 20,000 feet. That's the data. That's what Japanese intelligence says. That's what every combat report confirms. The aircraft above him are climbing 40% faster than they should be. Maguire rolls inverted, pulls through, and dives. His Lightning accelerates past 400 miles per hour. The concentrated nose armament, 1 20mm cannon, 4 50 caliber machine guns, all firing from the same point. No convergence issues, just a stream of bullets meeting at exactly where his gun sight points. The trailing Zero explodes. Tanemizu breaks left. Maguire stays with him, the Lightning's superior speed and power compensating for the Zero's tighter turn radius. At 18,000 feet, Tanemizu tries his last escape, a hard dive followed by a tight climbing turn. The P-38 stays on his wing. At 15,000 feet, Maguire fires again. The Zero trails smoke, then fire, then nothing at all as it tumbles toward the jungle below. 2 kills in 90 seconds. Maguire's flight claims 4 of the 6 Zeros. The remaining Japanese fighters disengage, diving for the deck where their maneuverability advantage might save them. It won't. Not anymore. When Maguire lands, his crew chief is waiting with a stopwatch and a notepad. Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith, the squadron operations officer, ordered performance monitoring on every flight using Lindbergh's modified technique. Sir, your climb from sea level to 20,000 feet took 5 minutes, 12 seconds. That's an average of 3,846 feet per minute. Maguire pulls off his helmet. His hair is soaked with sweat. The gauges read correctly. Manifold pressure peaked at 60 inches. RPM held at 1,600 throughout the climb. Fuel consumption was actually lower than our charts predicted. Lower? Yes, sir. You burned 112 gallons in that climb. Standard war emergency power would have used 173 gallons for the same altitude gain. Maguire does the math in his head. 35% less fuel for 40% better climb performance. The numbers seem impossible. Every performance chart says you need high RPM for high power output, but the data doesn't lie. And neither do the 40 pilots who didn't make it home. That night, word reaches Wright Field in Ohio, the Army Air Force's test and evaluation center, where every aircraft performance claim gets verified. Major Ronald Hayes, Chief of Fighter Performance Testing, reads the combat reports with increasing skepticism. P-38J Lightning, climb rate sea level to 20,000 feet, 3,800 feet per minute, standard tested rate, 2,700 feet per minute, claimed improvement, 41%. Hayes has tested P-38 seconds himself. He knows what they can do. This claim is absurd. Either the pilots are mistaken, the instruments are malfunctioning, or someone in the Pacific is fabricating data. He drafts a message to 5th Air Force Headquarters. Request verification of reported P-38 climb performance. Claimed rates exceed tested parameters by significant margin. Recommend instrument calibration and controlled testing to confirm accuracy. General Kenny receives the message and laughs. Actually laughs, which his staff hasn't heard much since Guadalcanal. They don't believe us. They think we're making it up. He calls in Lindbergh, MacDonald, and Major Peterson, the Allison technical representative who originally opposed the modified cruise technique. Gentlemen, Wright Field thinks we're reporting false data. Major Hayes wants us to verify our climb rate claims. Major Peterson, you've been monitoring engine performance for 6 weeks. What do you tell him? Peterson looks uncomfortable. 6 weeks ago, he predicted catastrophic engine failures. 0 have occurred. 6 weeks ago, he said Lindbergh's parameters were uncertified and dangerous. Every engine is running cleaner and cooler than standard operations. Sir, the data is accurate. I've personally verified the technique with instrumented aircraft. The P-38 achieves superior climb performance at low RPM and high manifold pressure due to several factors we didn't account for in our original testing. Explain it to me like I'm a general who doesn't understand engines, Kenny orders. Peterson takes a breath. Sir, reciprocating engine power output depends on 2 factors: how much air-fuel mixture you can compress in the cylinders and how fast you're spinning the engine. We always assumed you needed high RPM for high power. But Mr. Lindbergh proved that below certain RPM thresholds, increasing manifold pressure boost pressure gives you more power per unit of RPM. In English, Major. The turbo supercharger crams more air into the cylinders. At 1600 RPM with 60 inches of boost, each cylinder firing produces more power than at 2600 RPM with 54 inches of boost. The engine makes more power while turning slower. That means less mechanical friction, less heat generation, and more power available for the propeller. Kenny nods slowly. So Lindbergh was right, and our test procedures were wrong. Our test procedures measured what we expected to measure. Peterson corrects carefully. We tested maximum power at maximum RPM. We didn't test for optimal power to RPM ratios because we assumed peak power came at peak RPM. Mr. Lindbergh challenged that assumption and proved it wrong. Can other aircraft use this technique? The P-47 Thunderbolt uses the same principle, turbo-supercharged radial engine. Initial testing suggests similar improvements. The P-51 Mustang uses a mechanical supercharger, different characteristics, but there might be gains there too. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. I'll read the uploaded file first to understand the story. Number: The Mathematics That Saved 14,000 Lives. Charles Lindbergh's P-38 Miracle. Over the oil refineries of Balikpapan, something impossible happened. 16 P-38 Lightning fighters escorted 32 B-24 bombers on a mission 425 miles from base 850 miles round trip. The Japanese defenders were confident. American fighters always turned back at 300 miles due to fuel constraints, leaving the bombers vulnerable to slaughter. But at 300 miles, the P-38 seconds kept coming. At 350 miles, they were still there. At 400 miles, the Japanese realized everything had changed. The Americans had brought their fighters all the way to target. 0 bomber losses, for the first time in 6 months. This wasn't magic. It was mathematics. And the man behind it was Charles Lindbergh, yes. That Lindbergh, who at 42 years old proved that one civilian with correct calculations could change the course of a war. General George Kenney faced an impossible problem in the Pacific Theater. His bombers were being decimated because fighters couldn't escort them far enough. The P-38 Lightning, theoretically perfect for long-range missions, was failing to deliver. Pilots were nursing their aircraft home on fumes, arriving with dangerously low fuel reserves, if they arrived at all. The solution seemed obvious. You needed more fuel capacity, better engines, hardware redesigns. Except that wasn't the problem at all. Charles Lindbergh arrived in the Pacific in June 1944 as a civilian technical consultant. Controversial, brilliant, and carrying the weight of pre-war isolationism accusations, he nonetheless possessed something the military desperately needed: an engineer's mind and a pilot's instincts. When he examined how pilots were operating their P-38 seconds, he discovered something shocking. They were following the manual perfectly, and that was killing them. The Army Air Force's manual specified flying at 2,200 revolutions per minute because testing showed this delivered maximum power. But Lindbergh asked a different question. Was maximum power the same as optimal power? Through careful calculations involving fuel burn rates, propeller efficiency curves, and manifold pressure optimization, he discovered the manual had been wrong for years. By reducing engine RPM to 1,600 and increasing manifold pressure, pilots could achieve the same speed while burning 36% less fuel. The engines ran cooler, lasted longer, and gave pilots hundreds of additional miles of range. The establishment didn't want to hear it. Colonel Charles MacDonald initially resisted this, was decades of aviation engineering being challenged by a civilian. So Lindbergh did what any good engineer does when told his mathematics are wrong. He proved them in reality. He flew combat missions himself, 50 of them, demonstrating his techniques under fire. He engaged Japanese fighters. He optimized climb procedures, showing pilots how to reach altitude 41% faster than manual specifications. General Kenney faced a choice: wait 6 months for official approval through the War Production Board and Wright Field testing, or implement these life-saving techniques immediately without authorization. He chose lives over paperwork. It was a court-martial offense if he was wrong. But he wasn't wrong. The combat reports kept proving it. The bureaucrats in Washington were horrified. Colonel James Turner, Army Air Force's Material Command, sent messages demanding immediate cessation of unauthorized procedures. Return to certified parameters. Follow the regulations. Kenney's response was elegant. We're not stopping, but you're welcome to make it official. He had the numbers. Bomber loss rates dropped from 4.3% to 1.1% after implementing Lindbergh's techniques. That difference represented 87 aircraft and 870 crew members who came home alive. The Pentagon eventually capitulated. General Oliver Eccles, remembering how mathematician Abraham Wald had proven experts wrong about bomber armor placement, demanded Kenney's data. Wright Field ran formal tests. Every single one of Lindbergh's calculations checked out. By March 1945, his procedures became standard across all Pacific fighter operations, then expanded to European and Mediterranean theaters. An estimated 14,000 American lives were saved. President Truman wanted to award Lindbergh the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Lindbergh declined. He declined every award, uncomfortable with recognition from the government that had branded him a defeatist. But at the 1947 reunion of the 475th Fighter Group, when 230 combat veterans stood and applauded the man whose mathematics kept them alive, he couldn't deflect. Major Thomas Maguire Jr.'s widow gave him a photograph of her husband's P-38 with 38 kill markings. "Tommy said you taught him more in one afternoon than 6 months of training," she told him. That understanding why something works matters more than following procedures. Lindbergh kept that photo, and a plaque from the pilots. To Charles A. Lindbergh, who proved that one man with correct mathematics can change the course of a war. The legacy extends far beyond World War II. The newly formed United States Air Force established courses teaching pilots to question assumptions, to test real-world performance rather than accept laboratory maximums. Chuck Yeager, who would break the sound barrier, studied Lindbergh's work and acknowledged its influence. Sometimes you gotta test it yourself and prove the engineers wrong. Lockheed's technical history of the P-38 concluded that Lindbergh's operational techniques exceeded any hardware improvements in combat effectiveness. When Lindbergh died in 1974, investigators found his worn notebook from 1,944 pages of fuel, burn calculations, propeller efficiency curves, optimization tables. One sentence captured everything. "The manual told us to fly at 2,200 revolutions per minute because that's what testing showed was maximum power. But maximum power and optimal power are not the same. Sometimes you need to question the test." Modern aviation still uses principles Lindbergh derived. Commercial pilot fuel management training teaches cruise climb techniques directly descended from his 1,944 Pacific notebooks. The lesson transcends aviation. Question assumptions, test alternatives, understand that how we've always done it isn't the same as the best way to do it. 14,000 lives saved by mathematics, proven by a man willing to challenge authority when lives depended on it. The P-38 Lightning flew its last combat mission in 1945, but Lindbergh's principles never retired. They're still flying in every aircraft that cruises at optimal efficiency, in every pilot who questions whether the manual has the right answer, in every engineer who tests assumptions instead of accepting tradition. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the untold stories where mathematics, courage, and unconventional thinking changed history. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss another story of innovation triumphing over bureaucracy. Thanks for watching.